Grace is to works as Sarah is to Hagar. Grace is to works as Sarah is to Hagar. Now, Sarah, originally named Sarai, was the wife of Abram, later to become Abraham. They were called out of their land. They were asked to follow God and told three things by God. He would make them a nation. He would give them some land. And they would become a blessing of all the peoples, all the nations, or another way that word gets translated, a blessing to the Gentiles later in the development of the Old Testament. And the story's going along pretty well. They move into a new land. They don't have anything that's theirs. They're living in tents. A drought comes. They go off to Egypt. Through Abraham's desire to do things on his own, he tells a little lie and says that this woman is really his sister, not his wife, and she ends up engaged to the Pharaoh, and apparently the Pharaoh's actually went beyond engagement, is ready to marry her. And God intervenes and stops that whole thing from happening. And as a result, Abraham gets to leave the land with a nice bribe because the Egyptian Pharaoh feels in a culture of honor that he has dishonored Sarah. And as a result, he basically pays a fee of honoration for Sarah's life to Abraham. Included in that is some livestock and some slaves. And included in those slaves is a young girl by the name of Hagar. Well, then God shows back up again and says to Abraham, I'm going to make you a great nation. And Abraham is sitting there going, good night, I'm 90, Sarah's 80. How in the world is that ever going to happen? Well, he and Sarah have a conference about this. And Sarah says, you know what? Have you seen that Hagar we brought back from Egypt? Maybe that's what God intends for you to do. And under the rules of engagement, that sounds wrong. Under the rules of progeny, progeneration, some other word that I just made up, if Sarah's slave becomes a surrogate for her, then it's like Sarah's child. Except it doesn't work out that way. Because Hagar has this son. But the problem is the second she gets pregnant, she and Sarah begin to have a conflict between the two of them. So much so that you find that Sarah runs Hagar off, only for Hagar to come back. And this child is the one who's born to the second woman. Really, this is the second wife, because that's what Hagar really starts to go to. She begins to walk around the place no longer like the slave, but thinking she's the one who belongs, and Sarah's the one who does not. Now notice there's a quote in the Bible, or quote from the Old Testament in here. Verse 27. For it is written, be glad, O barren woman who bears no children. Break forth and cry aloud, you who have no labor pains. Because more are the children of the desolate woman than those of her who has a husband. If you've got a note on that, it tells you that's Isaiah chapter 54, verse 1. Now in Isaiah chapter 53, a text we referred to during Easter, we believe that to be a prophecy of Jesus. A prophecy of his death, of his atonement, of what he would do. Well, chapter 54 picks up on that and starts with this verse. But notice these other verses that come along afterwards, down in verses 4 and 5. Do not be afraid, you will not suffer shame. Do not fear disgrace, you will not be humiliated. You will forget the shame of your youth and remember no more the reproach of your widowhood. For your Maker is your husband. The Lord Almighty is his name. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. He is called the God of all the earth. The Lord will call you back as if you were a wife, what? Deserted and distressed in spirit. A wife who married young, only to be rejected, says your God. Isn't that interesting? This is where I think Paul gets the idea that he can apply Isaiah 54 to the story of Hagar and Sarah. Sarah's the young wife. Well, not anymore. Now she's the old wife. Abraham's trading in for his new trophy wife. Sarah, who feels like she's been abandoned, while this young boy has now been born to the second wife. And Paul says there's something greater than that. This promise to them is a bigger promise. Now, if you were a Jew and you read Isaiah 54, you're reading this, and you're reading this prophecy probably later as you've been taken to Babylon. And the promise of this text is that God has not forgotten you. He's not forsaken you for these short 70 years of exile. He's going to bring you back. But Paul does something amazing in his gospel. Paul begins to explain that this idea of exile is not just a story of the nation of Israel for a time away from God. It's the story of mankind. We're all in exile. But the fact is, while we may feel abandoned by God for a short time, God, through his power, is going to come back and restore himself to his rightful place as the one who we have the relationship with, who we have that first relationship with. Paul begins a theory in his gospel. You can see this in Romans 9 and through 11. You can see this in Ephesians chapter 2. A theory of the remnant, where the people that God is going to redeem are the faithful people, the people who will follow him and be obedient to him by faith, whether they're physically of the nation of Israel or whether they're spiritually the descendants of Abraham by faith. Paul begins to refer to them as the true Israel, or you may know them by another name. Paul calls them the church. This is our story. Our story is that God has come back for us. And the reason that this is able to work over the story of Hagar, and the reason the covenant of Abraham can work over the covenant of Moses, is because of the understanding of covenant. The first covenant is still in effect. See, Abraham never divorced Sarah. He's brought on a second wife. The Old Testament law says if you bring on a second wife, the first wife still stays in the same standing she is. You can't just replace her with somebody new. And it's the same way with the covenant. One other quote in this verse, one other quote in our text this morning, is that quote at the bottom. What does not the scripture say? Get rid of the slave woman and her son, for the slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with the free woman's son. If we don't go any further, we just say, well, the Old Testament says that. Anybody want to take a guess who in the Old Testament said that? But Sarah saw the son, Ishmael, whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham, was mocking Isaac. And she said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for the slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. Why does Sarah have the right to tell Abraham what to do with Hagar? Because, buddy boy, there was a day where you and I stood in front of the justice of the peace back there in Ur of the Chaldeans, and you said to me, I vow to love you in sickness and health, for goodness and wealth, and all that other good fun stuff that nobody remembers. But you also said, forsaking all others. I've put up with her long enough. It's time for you to forsake her and show her the way out the door. Because your agreement with me is priority. The law is not replaced by the promise of Abraham. And the law cannot replace the promise to Abraham, because the promise to Abraham is first. Grace was promised before law. Therefore, God has always wanted to operate under this concept of his grace.